there's a lot of energy beneath the surface that I think is good energy in education. There is a market demand for something different, and there's just a tremendous opportunity to do good work. You're going to face challenges at every level of doing good work. The punches are going to come out of left field, and they're going to be brutal, but the work is there to be done. I mean, somebody can change the world by changing education right now. That is absolutely true.
Hello and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with my friend Matt Bateman. For those of you who've been around for a while, you will remember that Matt was on the show a few months ago to talk about his work in the Montessori world. This is my very first, probably of many, repeat guests on the show. But over the past few months, Matt and I have been talking about doing an episode that is about all of the things that are wrong with our education system, why ed tech as an entire system is failing, why our grades are rising but our test scores are declining, why we have a teacher staffing shortage, why money doesn't seem to be able to fix the education problem, why we have this strange level of apathy about education as a whole, in spite of the fact that there are a lot of problems with the sector. Nobody seems terribly panicked about fixing it. And in talking about it, we decided to call it the Grinch episode, and we decided to do it the week of Christmas, both because it fits the Grinch theme, but also because during the holidays, parents are getting ready to spend their time around their families who may not share their level of criticism and also passion around education and the education system as we know it. So hopefully this episode can be helpful to them in preparing to have those conversations. Matt and I had a little over an hour to have this conversation, so this is definitely not an exhaustive list of all the things that are wrong with our status quo education system as we know it, but I think we covered a lot of ground. And we both make this very clear at the start of the episode, but I just want to really emphasize that while we're both kind of downers about education as we know it in this interview, we're both highly optimistic about education as a field. That's why we do the work that we do. That's why we're here. We're very optimistic about the future. We have a lot of passion for the possibility of what education ought to be, but it's also important to be realistic about where we're falling short. So that's what this conversation is all about. Thank you so much, as always, for being here and listening. Please rate, like, and subscribe the show if you have not already. And I hope that you enjoy this interview. I'm so excited about this. How long ago did we talk about doing a Christmas Grinch episode? It's been
Months. It was during the summer. We had the foresight to
do a Christmas
think about
Grinch.
Christmas. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And the Grinch part was your idea because I'm really homeschooled. So I was like, I didn't fully get the reference. I mean, I know Dr. Seuss, but in my head, Grinch was like a movie and I did not watch it. And I probably shouldn't admit that publicly, but
it's a book.
Now we all know.
I'll buy you the book for Christmas.
Aw. Amazing. You have to do like right inside the cover. Like this is, making up for your lacking pop culture education.
Exactly. Yeah.
But okay, so let's set the parameters for a Christmas Grinch episode, what this is. So there are two reasons why I'm really excited about this. One, because I have not had a sweeping conversation yet on the podcast that is a very clear breakdown of all of the things that are wrong in education. It gets alluded to a lot. Pieces of it get talked about, but I've never had just like a end-to-end conversation about all the things. And I think that's really important. I also really like the timing of it being over Christmas, not just because the Grinch metaphor, but because everybody's visiting their families and anyone who's doing anything remotely different from the status quo education path always have questions to answer. And so hopefully this will give people, like I see this as we're just going to like shoot through as many of these topics as we can and give people all the ammo that they need to field questions and have conversations with the in-laws over Christmas.
So we're taking awkward family holiday conversations and we're escalating them. We're like making them thermonuclear.
Well, maybe. I was thinking about this. You're the Grinch. I'm the optimistic. Like, no, it's it's going to be an interesting conversation and maybe someone will learn something.
We'll see. Maybe my heart will grow 3 sizes today, which you would get.
I did. You sent me the
I see.
ebook and I read it.
Oh, okay.
After we talked about this. Also, I read a lot of the Dr. Seuss books as a kid, just to be clear. I'm not sure how I missed the Grinch one.
So you already are aware of like Who mythology, the Who's.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, to some extent. Um, okay, and also we made the distinction when we were planning this that this is the Grinch episode and not the Eeyore episode,
That's
which I
right,
think is
yeah.
also important. We're not wallowing in our misery. We are just being very straightforward about what is wrong, but the overarching theme of the podcast is it's all fixable. We just have to figure out how.
Yeah, for sure. And that's important to say at the outset. I work in education, and so does Hannah, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in it. If I didn't believe that something better was possible and that this was indeed a really good time to be building something better. So,
I also, for those who are not familiar with you who have not listened to your last episode, you also you should listen to this first because it's timely with Christmas, but you should also go back immediately after finishing this and listen to Matt's original episode on the podcast because it was amazing. Okay. Ready to dig in?
yes.
Okay. So the first category of thing that we want to talk about is ed tech
Mm.
as a failed category.
The-
People have been building ed tech products for years, but it's not that revolutionary and it's not growing nearly as quickly as all of the other tech categories. Let's talk about this.
yeah, and it's not right out of the bat. I'm going to hedge my grinchiness. So
Wait a second.
it's not. It's that ed tech specifically is a failed sector, like this specific category of education technology. Not that technology is failing learners or that technology hasn't helped education or changed education. It has. But there's a specific subcategory of technology called ed tech where people go in and they build learning management systems or content platforms or just content or assessment tools, or they try to make tools to make higher education courses available to high school students or higher education courses available remotely. Or I mean, like IXL is probably one of the biggest and most used ones. Everybody listening to this will have some exposure to ed tech, almost certainly. Canvas, the Blackboard, the big LMSs. Um, and um, I, I have had more than one toe in the ed tech world for about 10 years. I've been pretty closely involved in a lot of ed tech projects, and we have our own technology arm. And it just, it, if you kind of pull back from the hype and the promise is real, and the hype is, I mean, the hype itself is real, as in it exists, but the hype is not real in the sense that it's true. If you pull back from the hype and the promise and just kind of look at how the sector has done over the last couple of decades, in a time when we've gotten the iPhone and all sorts of technology tools that have exploded and across virtually every sector. Ed tech is not that big. It was a decade ago. It was the cap of ed tech companies was something like 40 billion is a decent estimate. Now it's 80 billion. So it's doubled in 10 years. That's like, you're beating the interest. Like that's not that much of a change if you actually kind of look back at like the number of companies that have become $1 trillion companies, or what's happened to the delivery or hired car industries or things like that. Um, More than that, more than just the fact that it just doesn't seem to be, it seems to be stuttering. Like everybody thinks technology is going to solve education, and it just doesn't seem to be doing that much. The companies that do make it tend to be either fairly niche or doing something pretty traditional. So, I mean, one of the better known edtech companies is Duolingo, which is an app that teaches you how to speak a foreign language on your phone. And that it's a good app. I have nothing against Duolingo, no knocking it. Um, but has it really transformed schools or the education sector? No, it's mostly people who want to learn a language on their own, mostly grown-ups who want to learn a language on their own or before they visit a foreign country using this app to learn something, which is great. But I think of it more as like learning technology rather than something that's changing education, this systematic way that we raise children and educate children. IXL, which I think I already mentioned, is another good example. It's a math learning and assessment tool. It's huge. Tons and tons of people use it, and it's pretty good. But it's not changing the way that math education is done. People plug it into their existing curricula to Common Core curricula or whatever it is they're using, and they use it as an assessment tool to kind of benchmark where students are at in their learning. Again, perfectly fine tool. We use IXL at our schools, not knocking it, but it's not like it's dramatically personalized education or change the way that people educate. Um, the thing that has dramatically changed is not so much in the education space, but in the learning space with things like Duolingo. So YouTube is, I mean, to a first, second, and third approximation, YouTube is the best ed tech company. It's the biggest, it's the most impactful. It's weird to call it that. It's not like it's not an education company. It's a content company. But people have put massive amounts of content on there, some of which is incredibly good for learning things. Everything from learning cooking to learning every subject that you would want to learn. Russian history. I was looking up some Russian history recently. There's a ton of really good content on that platform. And that's that kind of use of the internet, of kind of internet content, Wikipedia, YouTube, Googling things, ChatGPT to get a kind of content overview. That's huge, but it hasn't, it's kind of like a layer of real world learning that hasn't really gone down and penetrated into the school system, or it hasn't fundamentally changed how schools work or how schools operate. So, and then all the technologies that have tried to go in and fundamentally change how schools work and how schools operate, they tend to hit obstacles and roadblocks in selling to public schools, in kind of interfacing with the existing school system and its own bureaucracy, and just kind of like colliding with the inertia that is the school system. So,
By changing learning outside of schools but not penetrating the school system itself, you mean that it has changed the way that adults learn and how people in the real world learn, something like
yeah,
YouTube, but
or
it's not fundamentally changing anything about the structure of
kids,
schools.
or how kids learn. I mean, it's not like if you want to learn ballet, like you're like, I can do a little bit of dancing, but I don't know anything about classical ballet, and I just want to learn the introductory moves. Like YouTube is great for that. If you want to learn how to cook something fancy, if you want to learn how to make a souffle or something like that, YouTube is great for that. What's something that you've used YouTube for recently to learn?
Uh, Honestly, a lot of podcasting stuff
A lot of podcasting
recently.
stuff. So yeah, if you want to learn like how to set up your audio so that you don't get cross interference and it don't get any lag when you're performing it versus when you're recording it. Um, it's great to learn that kind of thing. But it's not like there's still the kind of, you're going to take social studies as a fourth grader, or you're in a geology class, or you are learning English. I'm sure students will use YouTube for that, but it's not, there's still a kind of like basic process of sit in a class 40 minutes or an hour or 90 minutes, depending on what your schedule is, depending on whether you have a block schedule or whatever. But the teacher is giving you some direction as to what to do. You have your assignments. You do this day in and day out for 8 hours a day for 12 years of your life. And YouTube is kind of, and Wikipedia and the internet is kind of like an ancillary tool that you use to go through that, in my view, very stagnant process. Not something that's like, oh, like now that we have learning on demand at our fingertips, like that's just how we learn. We've jettisoned the whole system and we've revamped the whole system because we recognize that there's something new and great here. The system hasn't changed at all. And this other system has grown up almost like not even in parallel to it, but separate from it, that interfaces with it in kind of loose ways, which is interesting. But I mean, the premise of EdTech was like massively personalized learning. Like everybody has the equivalent of a software tutor teaching them things, and maybe that will come with AI, but so far it hasn't happened.
I think it's worth drilling in just for a second in a comparison between other sectors that have completely changed, just to emphasize what this can look like that we're missing. Maybe I'm stating the obvious, but I think it's worth like really highlighting like what's a sector that saw the kind of growth that was promised in ed tech.
So, I mean, if you want to own something, you can press a button and have it delivered to your door in about 24 hours. So it has totally transformed consumer shopping and all of the logistics associated with consumer shopping. Um, Both the kind of core convenience of it. I mean, you basically buy things on Amazon and buy things on sites like Amazon, but also the way that people do comparisons and find information and find the products that they want is now highly, it's much more efficient. It's highly algorithmic. I mean, I remember before Amazon the time before Amazon, when you would go into a store and you would look at the wall of, like, 17,000 chapsticks at Walmart and try to
Mhm.
figure out which chapstick you wanted, and you would go to Walmart whenever you wanted a chapstick. That was not a terrible system or anything, but the way that we do shopping for pretty much anything now is totally changed. Um, I think that the taxi industry is another good
Yeah.
example, like, just the I mean, how especially if even if you look at the personality of early days Uber, which was, in large part driven by its CEO and which I think was awesome. Um, it was like, we're gonna figure out how to get, connect drivers to people who want to rent drivers, drivers to users, drivers to customers. Even though it's illegal, even though in almost every city they were going up against, a taxi cartel, essentially, that there was a massive regulatory structure that they were up against. And they decided they were gonna punch through, F the system, they were gonna punch through, and they were really bold, when they moved into New York and New York threatened to shut them down. They created an alternate view in their app. De Blasio was the mayor at the time. They created a De Blasio view in the Uber app for just specifically for New Yorkers, where they could see what the Uber time would be like if the De Blasio regulation passed, and it was like how much slower it was. And so that they kind of like they saw that there was this massive system that was gonna be really hard to tackle and really hard to fight, and they just fought it, and now it worked, like, the world has changed. It's not like there's no other taxi industry now, but, I mean, they kind of won the battle. They kind of found the moral high ground and punched through and really changed the way that things are done. Nobody's done that in education yet. Just the kind of the ethos of Silicon Valley and of technology in general is like, yes, that is what we're going to do. We're going to go in and make these sweeping changes, and the world will never be the same. The world is basically exactly the same in schools as it was 20 years ago.
Is that a creativity problem or is it an execution problem?
Um, well, I think you first have to see just how um, there are certain industries, like the taxi industry, but also like healthcare, like education, for sure, that have a huge amount of institutional inertia and institutional bureaucracy, and there's a kind of way that it's done. They get a lot of public dollars, and there's a lot of I mean, with education, there's 100 years of kind of layers of accountability and mechanisms to deal with conflicts of interests, and all of it and underpinning all of that is this kind of ideology of, um, school is a thing that we do together as a society, this kind of like, um, this collective view of school, this socialized view of school, where, everybody from a community is gonna come in and everybody pitches in, and schools are accountable to who exactly? Schools are accountable to public schools are accountable to taxpayers, to voters, not to parents. And then there's a whole layer of teachers unions now, and so it's this very messy, complicated thing, and we can get into the kind of higher ed connection with that too, that has a certain, um, cultural place that's very, very hard to move. And part of it is just that it exists and it's hard to fight it, and part of it is that, it's not that obvious that people want to fight it. So the institution of, traditional public school is not reviled, in a way that at least once Uber came around and kind of found their moral high ground, the institution of taxi cartels compared to this very convenient thing that you could get on your phone, people were really annoyed at it. It became much less popular and people wanted the new thing. And that hasn't happened yet.
It's interesting to me that this hasn't happened yet because, I mean, I have spent my entire life very far outside of the Matrix, and so the Matrix looks very strange to me when you're not it's very strange to one that's not in it.
Mhm.
But it's still really weird to me that nobody cares about education enough to actually freak out. Like, I feel like any of the things that I post about on Twitter on a daily basis ought to be not just scroll stoppers on Twitter, but pattern interrupts for people going about their daily lives, because I'm talking about, mental health statistics that map onto the calendar of the public school year, and there's weird correlations there that are highly concerning, and I'm
Yeah.
talking about literacy rates inside, a country like America that is supposed to be at the forefront of everything, and 54% of the American population can't read at a 6th grade level, and, like, that I don't understand why these things don't freak people out, but there's this weird inertia, and we just sort of accept these very low standards as just being the way that it is, and I've heard you mention before that this wasn't always the case, like, 100 years ago, people did have care about education, and everybody it was
Yeah.
fashionable to have an opinion, and now it's not, and what happened? Why don't we care anymore?
Well, before we get to why we don't care anymore, I just think you kind of have to get inside the head of, like a middle class parent who cares an above average amount about education,
Mhm,
um, will move to a place that has somewhere between a decent to a very well regarded public school system. They'll vet it first. They'll kind of like read reviews and talk to other parents. Property values are often very related to
mhm,
how good the local public schools are. They might find like a high quality childcare to send their kids to for a few years before that, or they might do other things like reading a lot to their kids to kind of like give them a head start. And all those things are good. And then their child turns 5 and they're looking to start kindergarten. The emotional feeling that the parent will have is like, "Oh my god, this is so exciting. My kid's gonna get to, like, get on a school bus and put on a little backpack and go to school," and, like, it's not negative. It's not, I mean, if they were going to, like, an obviously terrible or decaying school with a huge bullying problem, it might be different, but, I mean, a lot of people who care about education find something or figure something out that to them, is satisfying, and then they're on a path through elementary school where they think that their kids will be basically happy. Middle school and high school can get dicey, but they're already kind of on this path now. And hopefully that they get into a good college. And this person is also thinking like, this is basically what I did. My parents did something like this for me. They sent me to a school, probably as good of a school as they could, or if they didn't, I'm the first person to do this, but probably my parents wish they could have done that. Um, and then I went to college, and then I got a decent job, and now I'm married and have kids, and things have worked out pretty well for me. So what's wrong with the system? What's really wrong with the system? And in some ways, this is the kind of grinchiest part of my belief system about education is just that is the problem. Like, there's so much wrong with the system. Like, you should not feel as a parent, yay, my kid is putting on a backpack and going on a school bus and is going to have this great experience. Relative to what's possible, relative to what a child needs, relative to what an adult needs, my view is even in a pretty good school, you're setting your child down path to learn a lot of compliance, to have a lot of missed opportunities for developing agency and interests and the capacity to think. And it doesn't look awful. It doesn't look like you're sending your child to a prison or anything, and you're not, but it's really bad. And that's the kind of delta that I think is, for people who are interested in education reform or who are interested in radical alternatives in education. I think nobody's really figured out how to puncture that or I don't know, bridge that gap. Um, um, it's even weird for me saying it, for me, like, describing this parent who's, like, excited about their kid. I'm like, "You should not be happy." Like, this is awful. It's way worse than you think it is. It's
okay,
so much
Mr.
worse than you think it is.
Grin.
But that is in fact my view,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of that as to why that is, I think there are historical reasons for it, if you wanted to go way back to the early 20th century, but now, it's nobody remembers anything else.
Can we talk about the historical context for a second? Because I actually think that's helpful.
Um, yeah, I mean, the historical context is that in the 1800s, in an early America, most people had homeschools or micro schools, what we would call today homeschool or micro school. Um, and there was you know, uh, there wasn't a standard curriculum, but there were tools that were increasingly becoming standardized, things like the McGuffey readers, that you would use to teach civics, some basic science content, that was pretty thin, some basic civics content that was pretty thin. History and literature it had more of, but mostly in the form of excerpts and passages. But the focus was really on literacy, to some extent rhetoric, learning the enculturation into your society, learning the kind of basic myths and stories and history. Um, and there were a lot of one-room schoolhouses. They were almost all private, mixed age. You'd go there, and I mean, I don't want to glorify it or anything. I don't think that we should go back to the 1800s. Like the teachers would yell at you and hit you with rulers, and it
The
was
switches on the
it was
wall.
pretty boring. And yeah, I mean, they're like good students have complained for. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was like, "Yeah, my education sucked. I grew up in Kentucky and had one of these kinds of situations, and like
Hmm.
it was boring. It was rote. It was worse for the brightest students." So, but that's how it looked for a long time. And then in the 20th century, um, for various reasons, we can talk about it if you want, but I don't know if it's necessary to get into. For various reasons, the view is increasingly that that system isn't working anymore.
Hmm.
That system isn't working anymore. We need something s- kind of more professional schools, more thoughtful schools, more intentional schools. Um, on the policy side and on the intellectual side, there was a view that like we can do a lot better. Like progressives, in the literal sense of people who believe in progress, thought we can do with education what we've done with medicine and science and hygiene, and we can make this thing that basically hasn't changed in 2,500 years much better. And those two trends collided. The kind of like, you know, Horace Mann, we need to institutionalize education and make it more widely accessible and make it more standardized and make it more professionalized, collided with the progressive. We can make this better. We can make this thing better. We can make this thing different. And in the 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, you got um, spreading, kind of radiating outward from New England, from Massachusetts and the Boston area, um, more and more students going to common schools, what we would today call public schools. And this was seen as a really good thing, especially in terms of enculturating immigrants and dealing with an increasingly large and diverse country, and updating a curriculum that hadn't really changed that much since, Newton, or pre-Newton in a lot of cases, to cover the content that people want. And, you know, it was, if you reform things in the 1920s and 1910s, there's something, you get flavors of Taylorism in it. You get this kind of, this is where the accusation of the factory model comes in. Taylorism is this management philosophy that like you can scientifically figure out the most efficient way to like, you know, put together a pencil or make a brick or whatever. Like certain workers will have more efficient movements, and you study them, and then you train all the other workers on it, and you design the factory to be as efficient as possible. And it's not exactly that people were doing that with schools. I think that that's the mythical part. Like, it's not like people were like, schools are like factories, but that was in the air. And the idea that schools are institutions that have a job to do, and we should kind of put them in place and standardize them. That, I mean, you kind of end up with the systems that we have today.
But why was it that people cared more then than they do now?
Um, I don't know exactly how to answer that question, but here's my best attempt to answer it. In the late 19th, early 20th century, like pre-World War I, there was an incredible cultural optimism about social progress. And you can, depending on where you sit on the political aisle, you can look at that very cynically. You can say, like, yeah, a bunch of like socialists were trying to do power grabs, and the government was expanding, and there were a lot of horrible things. But put that aside for a minute, and think about the advances in. So I'm just going to think about Maria Montessori, who was an educator, um, very near and dear to my heart. She went to medical school in Italy, and she, as part of her medical school, visited very poor communities outside of Rome, incredibly poor, crushingly poor communities, very ignorant and superstitious communities, and she helped them understand things like mosquitoes spread diseases, and you should use clean water for bathing and drinking and cooking and not just reuse your dirty water. And um, the sexually transmitted diseases that are plaguing your community, like this is what they are, and here's how to properly treat them, not the kind of bizarre voodoo ways that they, they attempted to treat them that just made the problem worse. And that kind of thing was seen as like, if we get everybody in the world being more hygienic and more healthy, that's good for that kind of that creates wealth, that propels society forward. And everything was kind of seen through that lens. Like, what can we do to make things better? And education was one of these areas that in the late 19th century, its time had come in a certain way. Like it was just, it really hadn't changed since like the 6th century BCE, or that's not true. It hadn't changed since like the 3rd century BCE, since the Hellenistic period. And people were feeling it, people were dissatisfied with it, and there was this kind of fresh optimism that was brought to it. Now, I think that there are things that, like, if you have a swing and a miss, and a swing and a miss, and a swing and a miss, like, people eventually lose that optimism. So, now people don't look at the system as crushingly horrible, nor are they generally optimistic about the prospects for social progress. They just see it as like something that they send their kids to, and they do the best that they can with them. It's just a different culture. I don't know if I'm really answering the question, but
No, you are. I think it's a very complicated question. We could probably spend 2 hours talking just about that,
yeah.
and it would be highly interesting, and maybe we should bookmark that for our next episode. Um, but I think there's also schools are way behind every other sector in terms of tech.
Yeah.
There's just like this long delay. So it's not just that the tech is moving forward. It's just moving forward very slowly.
It's like 10 or 20 years behind. As a
Mhm.
rule of thumb, if you get the internet in your home in 2000, like you can expect that schools will get the internet in like 2010 or 2015 or something like that. Like that there's like a 10-15 year delay. I mean, that's just a good rule of thumb. Yeah.
But there's also this interesting phenomenon where we talk about when people talk about innovative schools and innovation in general, there's a lot of pushback where it's like, this is just for the wealthy.
Mm.
Like the economically disadvantaged students don't have access to this, therefore it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
But you brought up an interesting point the last time we talked about this, which is like access to what?
Yeah.
Like just they have access to something that's marginally better, but it's really not all that different from what any other child would have access to.
Yeah. So, what you generally, if you're wealthy, what you pay for in education is a nicer experience and more qualified teachers, a system that looks largely the same. It's still scheduled in the same way. It's still tested and benchmarked against the same standards. Um, and to some extent, you're paying for a peer group. Like there's a certain status element to it. And I mean, you can get very cynical about that, but I actually think that's a fine way to think about it. And a lot of parents do think about it that way. I read this, there was a New York Times article, I don't know, like a year ago, 6 months ago, about this school in Europe that, very wealthy, like literally royalty, like the Duchess of whatever, send their children to.
Mhm.
And I mean, the photos of this, it looks like Hogwarts. It's like a castle, and it's $80,000 a year, and it's like they still have their classes. They still it's not like their teachers are like. I'm sure that their teachers are more qualified and kind of more motivated, but it's the same basic structure that you would get at like a public school or a magnet school or a charter school. It's not really that different. And parents so if you have $80,000 to spend on your child's education, or even more than that, it's not like you're like going for something radically different. You're going for a tutor that takes your kid around the world and travels. You're going for, you want to send your child to attend a farm school for 3 years where they like work the land and like study all of their science curriculum is connected to that. Whatever radical thing you can think of, like most people don't want that. It's not a matter of money. Money is generally not used to buy your child something innovative. It's used to buy your child something like with a little bit less variance, a little bit more predictable.
Mhm.
So like there's not going to be bullying, and you're not going to have a teacher that is just terrible and ruins the experience for everyone. But it's basically it's school. It's
Mhm.
recognizably school.
This is I find that there's a couple things about that that I find really interesting. So one is you're primarily on Twitter.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know if you've seen I've seen this mostly on Instagram. I don't know if this is bled over into Twitter, but there are these videos that are going around about prep schools and like elite private schools. And they're about like these are the secret things that they teach at elite private schools that you never learned. And
Oh,
like,
what is
well,
it?
it's like leadership skills,
Oh,
stuff like that. Or
okay.
like you sound so interested.
I mean, that
Or
that would be fine if they were actually doing
well,
it.
that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah.
It's either it's leadership skills or one of the videos that I saw was about um how in like in public school you just sort of learn how to follow the rules, but in private school, in these elite private schools, you're learning how to like not just look for an opportunity to apply for a job, but like you're going and finding the CEO and you're setting up like a lunch and you're, like really being proactive about making the things that you want in the world happen, which I watched that video and I was like, this is what we taught people in Praxis. Like this is not just reserved for elite private schools, and I don't know the validity of it even happening in schools. But my friend sent me one of these and he was like, this seems, like BS because he went to not an actual prep school, but like a school that was not like many people would probably classify it as such. He's like, and I like went to like I did programs that were full of kids that were going to legit prep schools and they didn't seem to know anything special about leadership that everybody else does. We weren't taught anything special, like, but there is this perceived sense of, you're learning a little bit more about how to be a leader in the world if you're the child of the leaders of the world and you're going to one of these schools. But I find it very interesting that, $80,000, it's a lot of money a year, especially if you have multiple kids. But if you're making millions of dollars a year, it's really a much smaller fraction of your income
Yeah, it's not that
than a
much
lot of like
actually,
middle class. It's
which
not
is
that much at
which is
all.
which I mean, it's a ton, so it's, like, more than I could afford, so I don't wanna
See,
kind of
but
poo-poo
but
that, but
but in terms of the ratio of
yeah,
your own income, a lot of middle class families are spending way more than that in terms of percentage
yeah.
on a private education for their kids because they care about it. It's very weird to me that it caps out at such a low rate. And also the fact that no one hires Aristotles anymore. Like, why is that?
Um, it's a good question. I think, like, you'd have to kind of, like,
Do
um
they? And we just don't know about it.
I don't think so. I don't think it ever really happens. So you could imagine a an approach to education where you're, like, doing something I don't know. This is not how I would approach education for my children even if I was a multi-billionaire, but
Mhm,
just you could imagine an approach to education that was, like, they're going to have 1 or 2 tutors that kind of organize their life or,
mhm.
help them help organize their education, keep track of things, like, keep tabs on things, and they're going to be very good educators. And as the child grows and has lots of room to explore their interests and learn more, these tutors hire like specialists, like, or connect the child with world experts in the field, or like, if this child is interested in linguistics, then they're going to go study with like they're going to get a special tutoring session with Steven Pinker or something like that. I don't even know if Steven Pinker does linguistics anymore, but like
Mhm.
somebody and that's kind of and if the child has a particularly special interest in that, maybe that will become the child's full-time tutor. So they're getting something very bespoke and custom. And you could say like, well, why would somebody world famous in the field do that? Well, I mean, Philip of Macedon offered Aristotle the world in order to tutor his son Alexander, and that's why Alexander did it. And there are people that have that kind of wealth, and as far as I know, they don't attempt things like that. I think Philip of Macedon offered to like rebuild Aristotle's entire hometown or something that had been devastated by a war, possibly one of his wars. But I mean that like if you're a multi-billionaire, like you can incentivize people. There are things that you can do. You can fund research. You can fund research institutes. You can make it worth one's while.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and I think the thing that does happen is like um, a high school student is connected like a tutor or a college counselor or somebody encourages a high school student to reach out to a professor at a research university and say that they're interested in this thing and, do they need anybody in their lab helping? And like there are versions of that that happen, but nothing that ambitious.
Should it happen? Should we have more Aristotles? I know there's the this gets into the elitism territory of well, most people can't have access to that, but, setting all of that to the side, like that's not the point of this question. Would it be beneficial for children to be learning from an absolute master of their field who's spending a handful of years completely focused on tutoring the child?
I mean, is it beneficial to the student to have a master tutoring them on something that they're interested in? Yeah, it's beneficial to the student to have that. Um, I don't I don't really think that that's, so the way that I think about education is between the ages of 0 and, I don't know, 14 or 15, um, there's a certain there's certain things that you're going through developmentally in order
Mhm.
to figure out your worldview, kind of get oriented, figure out who you are, find your place in the world, get a basic understanding of your mind and body, get a basic understanding of the things around you. Um, you're like building your basic self. And for that process, um, I don't think that tutors are like tutors have a like possibly have a role to play or mentorship has a role to play, but I don't think it's actually that significant. I think that what a child needs is certain opportunities in a certain learning structure that
Mhm.
will allow them to really master some basic things that will shape their mind and their worldview, but not in a kind of doctrinaire way where they have to like go through this really rote structure and they don't really understand it, and
Yeah.
they're kind of like they're what they're really learning is how to game the school system. So I think that there is something to getting a basic education, and I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like whenever tutoring is brought up, I kind of feel like imagine if people were like construction is so slow and is so slow in the U.S. and like it's like, well, what if we just multiplied the number of construction workers by 100? Wouldn't that speed everything up 100-fold? It's like, yeah, it would make things it would be really expensive, and
Mhm.
like in limiting cases, probably it wouldn't even be that helpful. But there's something wrong with the way of thinking about it. If like construction is really slow and expensive, of just like throwing people at the problem. I mean, tutoring is basically throwing people at the problem of education. That's what tutoring is. And there's something to be said for that because education is a process of communication to an
Mhm.
individual, and tutoring is it's a crutch, but it's a very helpful crutch. It's an
Mhm.
effective crutch in certain cases, but um, I think it's fine to do that, but I don't think that that's what the future of education looks like. And if I had all the money in the world, I don't think that I would set up the education for my children that way. I think I would be something closer to the farm school thing that I mentioned earlier, where like they were given an opportunity and a lot of space. And
If you had all the money in the world, you make your kids go work on a farm.
yeah, yeah.
It just sounds funny. I agree with the logic.
I mean the
That's the title of a blog post, though. If I had all the money in the world, I would that's a tweet. If I had all the money in the world, I would not hire my kids Aristotle, I'd make them go work on a farm.
I mean, if my children were very interested in something, I mean, I think like most 13-year-olds don't know what they're going to do in life. And
Yeah.
it's also very hard to find incredibly good generalists. I mean, Aristotle was the last true kind of like omni generalist of the world, who literally knew everything, or at least that's what people say. Um, but if my child were like on the path of becoming a jazz musician and I had all the money in the world, would I give them those specific opportunities and specific lessons and specific tutors? Yeah, I would. But for their kind of basic civics, math education, their basic construction of agency, I I think I would want something different. I would want a community that had a certain kind of, very high bar learning structure,
Mhm.
um, but where there was a lot of freedom and it wasn't dominated by a small number of adult personalities.
Today's episode is brought to you by the John Galt Mortgage Company. I promised myself when I started the show that I was never going to have a sponsor unless I could truly endorse what they are doing. And that could not be more true for the John Galt Mortgage Company. My friends Mitch and Tim started the company earlier this year after working in the real estate world for years and realizing that mortgages are way more expensive than they need to be. Most real estate agents don't actually know how much extra profit is baked into the cost of a mortgage. So Mitch and Tim started a new kind of mortgage one where they cap their own profits on every transaction and pass the savings along to you, the buyer, in the form of a lower interest rate. If you are in the market for a house, I absolutely recommend checking out what Mitch and Tim are doing. You can find more at www.johngaltmortgage.com, or you can find the link below in the show notes. Okay, back to the show.
We're getting pretty far away from the Grinch.
We are. I'm sorry. I got distracted by the shiny thing. Okay, let's come back to the Grinch stuff. So we talked a little bit about the fact that like people are not nearly as panicked about education as when you look at the raw numbers they probably should be. But at the same time, there is a decline in faith in our school system. There's sort of this like long, slow descent into apathy. I don't even know.
Well, COVID, I mean, really shook people up. I mean, it's not like I think that there was a lot of latent dissatisfaction, latent in the sense of people wouldn't necessarily think about it as they were dissatisfied by their school, but like, they weren't over the moon about it. They weren't like ready to go to bat for it. They weren't like, yeah, rah, rah school. They were just like, yeah, like, it's probably pretty okay. And then COVID, Zoom school, like everybody's K-12 student during Zoom school saw that like, oh my God, it's horrible and nothing happens for most of the day. And this entire profession seems like incapable of adapting to this new situation. Even if it's going really well, it's like not that good for my child. And, and so I think that really accelerated the dissatisfaction that you do see today.
But there are good reasons for there being a decline in faith in the school system. The academic standards thing is really interesting. The question of, are academic standards decreasing? Can you talk about that a little bit?
I mean, I don't know if they're decreasing, but they're horribly low. Probably they are decreasing slightly, but they're decreasing from a low point. I think I saw some statistics that the number of A's and B's is going up steadily, even though test scores are declining.
Yeah,
steadily.
I shared something on Twitter recently that was it was a graph of ACT scores declining and test scores simultaneously going up.
Grades, you mean?
Or, I'm sorry, grades.
Yeah, I mean, grades are a lie. Grades are a lie, and grades have only become more of a lie over time. And all of the institutional pressure from higher ed to high school to middle school to elementary school is to give students A's and B's. There's just no reason why teachers wouldn't do that. I mean, there are good reasons in reality why you wouldn't want to do that, but there's no kind of institutional structural reasons why teachers wouldn't do that. And so it's your A on your report card is your participation trophy. It doesn't mean anything. But that's a trend that's been going on for a long time.
Give me a ballpark of what you mean by a long time.
As long as I've been alive.
Okay. Can we go here? Can we also talk about the fact that it's very like A's and B's are super common in teachers' colleges too?
In teachers' colleges, what do you mean? Like that teachers like if you get a master's degree in education?
Yeah, that they get really high grades but tend to score lower on tests.
But we can go there. I just don't know that it's any worse than any other humanities master's program or graduate program. Like, I mean, I did a PhD in philosophy. Like, if you got a C, you were like failing out of the program. Like a C wasn't like, oh, you did like what a C should mean is average, right? That's what I was taught that it meant. And when I've graded papers and wanted to use the full range, I've thought that like a C was like this was acceptable, but not excellent. A C in any humanities graduate program means that you are in danger of not completing. Something has gone really wrong. If you kind of put in a minimal effort, you will get something like a B+ or an A-. And that's not unique to teachers' colleges. I would believe it of teachers' colleges, but it's not unique to teachers' colleges.
I know we're going to deviate a little bit, but you must satisfy my curiosity for a moment. Why is that true of all the humanities?
So, I'm going to answer this question in a really circuitous way.
Okay.
Okay. So, what in education, when does your credential or transcript actually matter in education?
Most when you're applying to the next level of education.
Yeah. So, basically there are some exceptions, but to a first approximation, the only time that your transcript and credentials matter in life is when you're applying to college. So when you're a senior in high school and you're applying to college, then it matters that you have A's. It matters what your SAT scores are, and so on. Um, there is everything in the education system is kind of like a crunch towards that point.
Mhm.
Everything like this is the only point. This is the highest pressure point. It's not when you graduate college. Nobody. I mean, some employers do look at your transcript, but most of them don't. Like, it doesn't matter if you got a C in French in college. Nobody cares. College students don't know that. College students have been, kind of trained in the school system to want to get A's, and so they're
Yeah.
very concerned with getting A's. But in reality, it doesn't matter. It might matter if you're trying to get into a graduate program, but again, like, exceptions can be explained, and other things matter more. The thing that matters the most is when you're applying to college, and there it does matter. And so if that matters, then th- there's there's kind of continuous customer pressure from students and parents who want more than anything for their children to get into a good college, for them to be able to get good grades. And there is no institutional downside to just giving the customer what they want. Like, if you give, and when I was a college professor and I had freshmen every year, I would have somebody every semester. I would have somebody crying in my office because I gave them a B, crying in my office, and it's like, it's not their like, they've never had this experience before.
Yeah.
They think that it means that they've failed and are terrible. I mean, there's so much pressure kind of going up through high school, and then they're still kind of at the tail end of that pressure in college.
Mm.
To get good grades, to be perfect. It's not that hard to get an A, and so you should get an A. And then that will guarantee that you get into a college, and you're kind of
Mhm.
that's a check mark. And this is how students think about it, and teachers just why wouldn't they give the A to the student? Is their reputation on the line? Are they going to get fired?
Mhm.
Is their administrator going to come to them and be like, no, we want the average grade to be a C at our school? Like, students would just not go to those schools, or they would face a mountain of parent complaints, or
Right.
so it's just kind of steadily moves in the A direction. The credential just doesn't mean anything.
Your comment about the grades mattering to get into college, and that's the only time that they matter, is really important and worth delving into just a little bit. The fact that the center of gravity of an entire education experience hinges around that senior year of high school, and really the junior and the senior year, like,
Yeah.
when you're applying to colleges, but that's, like, everything that you're doing. I passed a huge sign the other day along the side of the road, something, I forget the exact wording of it, but it was, like, some private school, and it said, "College prep, preschool through whatever,"
Oh, yeah.
and I was like, those words in a sentence are, I know it's a phenomenon, but it felt like a meme to
I
me.
mean, there are early childhood centers that are like Yale Early Childhood Center, and they have nothing to do with Yale, the university. But I mean, what they're doing is they're playing on this idea that, you start preparing, like, the thing that you're trying to do is to prepare your child to get into a good college. Like,
Mhm.
that's what sets you up for success in life. And so, that's the brand.
And it's weird even that, like, I know people who've dropped out of Ivy League colleges,
Mhm.
and dropping out is part of their personal brand, and that's the badge of honor, but
Well,
really the badge of honor is that they dropped out of, they were in the Ivy League college in the first
exactly.
place.
Yeah. So I mean, this is more true of ultra elite universities than it is of, like, very good solid universities. Like, if you drop out of, like, I don't know, UTK, the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, like, nobody's like, wow, you dropped out of UTK, even though, like, it's a perfectly good school.
Mm.
But if you get into an ultra elite school, like, somewhere in the Amherst to Harvard range, or Stanford, MIT, these Ivy League
Mhm.
or adjacent liberal arts colleges or technical colleges, and you drop out, like, it doesn't matter how what matters is that you got in. It doesn't
Right.
matter what grades you got. It doesn't matter even if you finish. What matters is that you got in. That's, I mean, weird.
But it's true. The crux point is that you got the stamp of approval
Right,
from the admissions board
right,
at a high level university.
right.
The fact that you chose to not take advantage of that just means you're a rebel, but
Yeah,
you got in.
Brian Kaplan has this thesis that, education serves a signaling function,
Yes. We talked about that a lot at Praxis. That was our whole thing.
um, and, which is very plausible. I mean, the idea is that it shows that getting into an Ivy League school shows that you're smart, it shows that you're compliant, and it shows that you're conscientious. Like, it's like, it doesn't show that you, like, are a great person or know a lot, but it does show some it would be very hard to get into an elite university, without having some degree of intelligence, without knowing how to work the system, which is a kind of compliance, without knowing how to, kind of be good at the school system, be good at the school game, take AP classes, like, have the right electives, have the right extracurriculars. And like, like, probably you can't get there just by skating by. You actually have to, like, consistently apply yourself for at least some stretch of time in order to get into these schools.
Hmm.
Um, that's all it signals. It doesn't signal anything about the quality of the education that you got. It doesn't signal anything about the quality of education that you're going to get. You could get, I think you can go to, you can go to Harvard and get a great education, but you can also go to Harvard and screw around and still get A's, and like your education doesn't amount to much, and it doesn't mean like you went to Harvard. It doesn't matter.
This is a really crudely, it's not refined, approximation of the point that you're making, but it's kind of like there are lots of different types of signaling mechanisms. So a university degree is one. I spend a lot of time on the internet, like
Mhm.
follower counts are another.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If somebody has 100,000 Twitter followers or 500,000 Twitter followers, there's some level of social proof of like, oh, this person must have something interesting to say. If they have this many followers, I'm going to pay more attention to their comment, perhaps, than like your knee-jerk reaction as a user of a social media platform. It's like this person, like the democracy has weighted this person's
Yeah.
opinions as being more valuable than someone else's, but it really, and everybody has a knee-jerk reaction to it. Like everybody put some level of clout on that, but
Mhm.
it's not, you have no idea who those 100,000 people are. There's a
Yeah.
huge quality bar between the people who are following, like,
I mean,
a scientist versus a,
yeah.
video game account or whatever.
I mean, here's the Grinchy point for
Yes.
education. What is the credential that signals that you're well educated? There isn't one, in my view. There isn't one. I mean, whatever you think well educated means, whether
Mm.
like a kind of like familiarity with a canon and a capacity to think for yourself, and like there's no credential that means that. And I mean, the credentials do mean something. They're not meaningless, but
Right.
I don't think that they mean that you're well educated in the sense that I would consider, and that a lot of people would consider taking well educated. And I also think that there are people who are well educated. It's not that being well educated is a myth and that it doesn't exist. It's just totally uncorrelated with any credential.
So there's also, we talked about the decline in faith in the school system, academic standards. There's also a teacher crisis. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and that what do you mean by that? That teachers that the profession is losing teachers?
Well, there's a bunch of, yeah, teachers, there's a huge teacher turnover. Teachers generally aren't getting paid enough, or they're at least not getting paid a lot relative to other fields. Masters in education, like, kind of what does that mean? What does that get you? There's just, like, a lot of things to be grinchy about on that front too.
I mean, there's a lot of things that go into kind of teacher quality of life. Um, I think that the biggest so if you like me think that education mostly sucks, um, how pleasant is it, do you think, to work in a profession like that?
You tell me. You're working in the
I'm
profession.
working in a profession like that, but I've also like I kind of have a full stack vertical implementation of, we run a whole school system. We hire the teachers. We have a totally different approach. We open the schools, we operate the schools, we do the administrators, we do everything. It's not like we go into public schools and offer a better math curriculum or something like that.
Right.
Or it's not like if I was going to be a teacher, and I was going to go teach, I don't know, literature at a high school. That's a plausible thing that I could do. I think I would be pretty good at it,
Oh,
teaching
yeah.
literature in a high school. Um, I would never wanna do that. That sounds like a horrible job. I mean, never say never, but, like, you should assume that you're dealing with high school students who have been through, you know, 9, 10, 11 years of a system that, in which they're taught to kind of, like, pine for grades and respond to certain kinds of rewards and punishments in certain way, that they've developed very little agency, that probably there's a better than chance odds that their appreciation for literature has been killed or crippled rather than properly cultivated, and so what you're doing is mainly remediation. Um, I'm just assuming that I would be working at a decent school without disciplinary or behavior issues, but that's not always the case. Sometimes what you do as a teacher is a tremendous amount of, kind of culture management, behavior management, classroom management. I have seen an increasing number of complaints about this issue, that there's been a kind of real decline in the quality of, um, student behavior. I don't know whether or not that's true. I don't know whether it's just like anecdotes, kind of compounding, but even if it's just anecdotes, like that is a lot of teachers' experience. Um, and then there's the fact that like, what would I be doing? Would I be teaching like 4, 5, 6 sections of literature per day?
Mhm.
What would the format of that be? Would I have 45 minutes with the students and they come in and they do their work and then they leave again? Like, and where do they go after that? Like, I don't want to, like, however good I make my classroom, and I think I could make it good and inspiring and engage a lot of the students ultimately. Like the fact is that you're you're working in a system, you're trying to do good in a system that either is profoundly indifferent to you
Mhm.
or is hostile to you doing good things or some combination of those two things. I don't care how much you pay me. I don't want to do that. Conversely, if that wasn't the case, if I was teaching literature in a system where like, no, like these children love literature and they're coming to you and like their other classes are great and they're benevolent towards one another and like, yeah, you've only got 45 minutes with them, but like you have confidence in the system. Um, I don't think I would need that much money. So it's just it I the, somehow lost in the fact that teachers are leaving the profession, or often lost in the fact that many teachers are leaving the profession, is that education isn't good and that they don't like that. Nobody likes to work at a job where they don't feel like they feel like they're either not having an impact or they're having an impact despite everything.
Mhm.
That sucks. That's a nobody very few people can do that sustainably over the course of years. I should also say I'm not totally sure there is a teacher crisis. There is in the sense of, the kind of perennial grinchy point is that I mean, it tends to be that, um, it's pretty rare that great people go into education. There are great people in education, but it tends to not attract the best talent. The best talent tends to go elsewhere. Um, but I think that it's probably more turnover, less retention, um, than there is normally, but also public school enrollment is declining. So, like, it might be that I don't know, this might end up being a silver lining of sorts, a kind of grinchy silver lining where, um, rather than needing to fire a huge number of teachers because the school districts don't have enrollment anymore, they just kind of quietly let teachers resign and quit until they're at the right number.
Mhm. It's also it's worth noting, we've sort of come at this from a couple different angles, but I think it's worth looking at head on the fact that when you look at the numbers, public education and private education cost very similar amounts per student, not
Oh, yeah.
obviously to the families, but in terms of delivering an education, the cost is very similar.
Yep.
And whether you're throwing private dollars at the problem or whether you're throwing public dollars at the problem, money really doesn't seem to solve anything.
Yeah. I mean, people don't know how much, per student dollars go into public education. It's a lot. It's like, I mean, it depends on where you live. A lot of it's cost of living adjusted, but like, I think in New York, it's over $30,000
I
per
think on a
student.
national level, it's somewhere between like 19 and 21,000 or something
Yeah,
like that. It's a lot of money.
it's a lot of money, and in cities, it's an astronomical amount of money. Um, and the kind of counter argument to that is like, well, a lot of it goes to special ed student or special needs students and special education, and that I mean, there's something to that argument, but it's not like it's like a quarter of it goes to that. So it's like, okay, rather than 32,000, the New York budget is, you know, 24,000 per student. It's still very, very high, relative to what you're getting. And comparing it to kind of private school tuitions that seem nicer, though, again, I think that they're fundamentally similar and the same. You don't always get something better.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think if you could fix education with money, it would be fixed with money. You can't fix education with money.
What about, again, we've kind of danced around this point too, but I think it's worth looking at head on. do parents even want a better education? Like, do people actually want this? As part of the problem that the market doesn't exist? And there are a couple of reasons that you have to ask this question. One is, I mean, it is just hard to find good education. Michael Strong, who's also been on the podcast, has a really great essay about the title is something along the lines of why do we have better information on sports cars than we do on schools?
Mhm.
Like why is it easier to find information on like the specs of, buying a new vehicle than it is on educating your child? But also, we it's weird that, $80,000 is the cap,
Yeah.
roughly speaking. But, like, that's how much an extremely expensive elite school costs, and, think of all the other things that parents that are sending their kids to that kind of school are spending money on, like, first class plane tickets. You've brought that up before, like, all of these things that
Yeah.
are
I mean, if you're spending $80,000 on your child's education, probably what the percentage of students graduating from their senior year of high school get into ultra elite universities. That is probably something that you know.
Mhm.
Um, but that's I mean, but then that's what you're buying basically as a parent. You're buying admission into a college, and that's one of many ways that you can use money to buy admission into an elite college. And I think that that is something that parents want. Um, a lot of what parents want is um, legitimate, but pretty unrelated to education. That's my view on. So I think when most parents think about education, they are by and large not actually thinking about education. They're
To think
not
about, like, status, network,
status, networks,
opportunity.
opportunities, peer group.
Right.
They're not thinking, which are again perfectly legitimate things to think about. This is the Grinchy point is not who are all these parents thinking about peer group. They suck. That's fine. The Grinchy thing is, um, what does it take to get someone to care about, you know, man, I just feel like my child, like, their literature class was okay, but it could have been killer. Or like, why does my
Mhm.
child hate history? Like, shouldn't they, or they're indifferent to history. They're just doing it to get the grade. Like, why can't they fall in love with it and like get something from it and have it transform them? Why aren't they having these amazing educational experiences? And I don't think that most parents really think about that.
So we spent a lot of time being very Grinchy. We need to what you told me how this story goes. The
And
heart grows three
the
sizes.
heart,
We
how
need
the
we
heart
need
grows
to
through
end this
sizes.
on something that is more optimistic than all of this, because I know that the reason we wanted to do this is because you're a wealth of knowledge of all the things that are wrong with the education system, and that needs to be like, it all needs to be named. It's an important part of the conversation. But I don't think you'd be doing the work that you're doing if you were actually pessimistic about the possibility. Like I would I'm kind of putting words in your mouth, and you should correct me if this is not a correct representation, but I feel like you're a realist, but also you're highly optimistic about the possibility of the future.
Yeah, I mean, look, what you have to understand about education is that the field has been thoroughly destroyed, thoroughly destroyed. Um, if you kind of squint and you look at it with one from one legitimate perspective, it's just never been born to begin with. It's just like it's just kind of stillborn. It like kind of got solidified in one room schoolhouses in the ancient world, and we've had some sort of version of that that interacted with different iterations of higher education and never really changed. And from another perspective, like even that has been kind of mitigated and destroyed. And the specific thing that's been destroyed is, which is I think really an artifact of the public school system, is that nobody knows how to think about questions of education anymore. Nobody's really responsible for it.
Mhm.
It's largely a bureaucratic, administrative, government-run affair. It's kind of like healthcare. It's like, who's really responsible for the health of the patient? Like, similar questions come up in education. It's not parents don't feel the burn of like, "Oh my god, I've gotta figure out, like, what my child is learning and to make sure that their quality of learning." It's like they generally are, like, choosing amongst public schools that are all pretty similar to one another, and there's no market for alternatives, or there's a very limited market for alternatives, at this late date in history. Um, so in a way, I mean, if you look at that, there's a certain way that it's like, well, that's terrible. I don't want to get into this field. But there's a way that it's such an opportunity. I mean, it's not low hanging fruit. It's very high hanging fruit, but it's a whole field that has had stagnation and setbacks and problems and has been subject to the worst kind of government oversight and um, has the worst kind of signaling statusy bureaucratic inertia behind it. Like if for a certain kind of person, a certain kind of parent or a certain kind of entrepreneur, you look at that and you think, wow, like this is where I can make a difference. There's so much to be done. And that is definitely the way that I see it. And I'm not cynical about um there's a I mean, now is probably the best, especially in this post-COVID time, but with the internet, with the rising level of dissatisfaction about education, with alternative pedagogies, some of which are quite good in my view, even if they've never been consistently or fully implemented, or even if they need to be worked out. There's a lot of energy um, beneath the surface that I think is good energy in education. There is a market demand for something different, and there's just a tremendous opportunity to do good work. You're going to face challenges at every level of doing good work. The punches are going to come out of left field, and they're going to be brutal. The work is there to be done. I mean, somebody can change the world by changing education right now. That is absolutely true.
Yeah, and there are some I mean, anyone who's listened to multiple episodes of this podcast knows that there are lots of people that are working on taking different types of stabs at that problem on varying philosophies and at varying levels of scale. And I know what you're talking about is much, much bigger than innovating on, like the classroom model. Like we're going to have a micro school instead of a public school, but
Yeah,
it's the same curriculum. Like you're talking about something orders of magnitude beyond that of like rethinking from first principles everything that we think
it's
about when we
it,
think about raising a child.
yeah, it's orders of magnitude beyond that, but it's also like, I mean, even just simple things right now, like the fact that there is just not the same stigma and legal obstacles to homeschooling now that there was when I was a kid.
Or even when I was a kid, it's fairly different.
And if forget if you're an entrepreneur, let's just say you're a parent, you don't have to wait for this whole stupid system to change. I mean, this is one of the great things about what kind of cracks in the system start showing is you can just opt out now and create the perfect life for your child and or the kids in your neighborhood or whatever you want on a very small scale now, and you can ignore everything else and it'll be fine, and they'll have a much better experience. And that is just the fact that that's easier now and more allowable now, is a good thing. It's a little bit depressing to me that more people aren't taking advantage of it. More and more people are, but it's
Mhm.
like it's not like millions and millions more. It's like 1,000,000 more, 2,000,000 more, which is it's a large number. It's something to be
But
happy
when you
about,
look
but
at it
it's,
on a chart, it's a steep incline from where it was even when my parents were homeschooling me,
yeah,
a
it's
couple
it's
decades ago.
it's grown, but it hasn't grown at the speed of like Uber.
For a moment there, I got all excited. I was like, "Is that the Grinch's heart growing 3 sizes?" But
uh
then you brought it back.
I mean, it's growing, and it's good that it's growing, and and one should only be happy about that.
Mhm.
But 90% of children go to public schools in the U.S. Depending on how you define public schools, somewhere between 85 and 90%.
Mhm.
And most parents are satisfied with their experience, and you know, it's a minority of people who kind of have the vision to be dissatisfied, and I think it's a virtue to be dissatisfied, and it's a hard thing to be dissatisfied when everything else about the system and your life and society like wants you to kind of accept and wants you to be okay with whatever exists and tries to paint it in the best light possible, even though it sucks.
It's a minority, but it's not a small minority, and I think that's also really important to emphasize. 1 in 10 families, roughly, the numbers don't divide exactly across, like, how many children per family versus how many children in the school system, but, like, 90% of kids in the school system, 10% homeschooling or in a private school or something, we'll say 1 in 10.
Yeah,
That's a lot of people.
that's a lot of
You
people.
walk into any room of any substantial size, you're not the only one there.
It's a lot of people, and if you told me that in 20 years it was 1 in 5, I would be really happy, even though I would still think it was too slow. But I think that there's a chance that in 20 years it could be, 1 in 20. Like, it's not that I don't think you can read off of
1
direction
in
and
20, you mean it could decline again? Okay. That is entirely possible. I'm definitely
Mhm.
very aware that we're riding a wave of momentum that has no guarantee of continuing, but it's also there are a lot of factors at play that are with the school choice movement
Yeah.
and the big wave of homeschooling and just the conversations that are happening, and just the fact that there has been, while it has been slow, it has been relatively continual. There has been this increase in people exiting the system ever since, like, the '70s, um, to,
I think that that's true. I think that there are always a million things that can cause regression to the mean, and regression to the mean is the default. But, I mean, I am actually optimistic that it will continue on a better trajectory.
There we go, the heart's growing again.
I mean, I just at the end of the day, I don't really think that there are any passionate defenders of the traditional system.
Oh, you should hang out in my Twitter replies. Yes, there are. There are lots of them, and they find me. But no,
There
I
are
know.
passionate defenders of certain things about traditional education. Like, there are passionate defenders of, direct instruction, or they're passionate defenders of classical education, which is kind of like a neo-traditionalist, or I don't know what the opposite of neo is, model, that's kind of more intentional and thoughtful, and I have critiques of all of those approaches, but what I don't see is of people being like, "This the" you know, having a school district and a school board and this administrative structure and classes like this and like everything leading up to, your senior year of high school. Like everybody's just kind of like, they accept it.
Mhm.
Nobody's like, this is great. That's my view. Maybe in your Twitter replies, I'll find people who do think that it's great.
It's an interesting mix of perspectives sometimes. Um, but I think I am inclined to, I don't know, I think that there are some staunch defenders of it. I would argue at that point, but I also think it's not the same level of, like, cult enthusiasm as, like, a really explosive brand or product or movement has, and I think there's a level of enthusiasm that is attainable with something other than that would far outstrip the enthusiasm around the public school system.
Yeah. I mean, I don't really see it at the policy level. I mean, there's defenses of the status quo in terms of like, I don't know, the kind of like just literally the status quo of teacher unions and the school district system, but it's like, this is good for communities and families, not like this is a great system. It's just, the kind of populist defenses that you see of any existing system. I haven't read books. Nobody's showed me a book recently that's like the current public schools, the best thing about America, like I
Yeah,
just,
okay, that is fair.
right. But that's significant. Like that. I mean, people do write books like thinking about a future of education that could be very different, or
Mhm.
about technology revolutions, or I mean, you do see things like, I don't know, I've got a book on my coffee table, like called something like National Parks, America's Best Idea, or something like that. Like
Mhm.
there are people who defend things that they think are kind of morally good and excellent, and I think that all the inertia is in the other direction. So that's my optimistic take.
Mhm. That's a good white pill to close this out on. I know we could keep going for a long time, but I know you have somewhere you
Oh
need
yeah.
to be. But thank you for this. This was really fun. I hope that people found it useful, and I'm glad that we had the time to actually talk about all of these things that come up in conversation but never necessarily get organized as they are here. This is good.
Thanks for having me, Hannah. It's
Thanks,
always
Matt.
fun. Yep.
There are a couple of things from this conversation that I think are really important and interesting and worth emphasizing. And Matt and I had a hard stop time, so we didn't have a chance to get into all of this. But there's just a couple points that I want to emphasize about this conversation. I think Matt and I are both in agreement, and we've talked about this extensively, that there's just a strange amount of apathy about the conversation of education in some circles. There's a strange amount of inertia around the status quo. It's a very hard thing to step away from. And I think in some ways it's a particularly difficult field to innovate in, not just because it's so massive and so bureaucratic, because it's something that also feels so precious and so important. And therefore, the stakes feel very high to get wrong. Something like Uber innovating the taxi industry, there's Obviously, there are stakes at play. You're getting in a car, you're in a moving vehicle. There are risks that are associated with that, both physically, but also logistically. You need to make sure that you can get a ride reliably and that you can get where you're going on time. But it doesn't generally carry the same amount of stakes and the same level of weight as the education of your child. That's a very frightening thing to get wrong. And parents care a lot about the educations of their children, as they should. They care a lot about their children's futures. And I think there's an important distinction to make there, too, because to Matt's point earlier, parents care about the future of their children, but there are a lot of things that are probably more important factors than the raw education. The education is a means to an end. It's a means towards a child being able to function in the adult world and think about the world around them and make informed decisions and land a job and maintain that job and succeed in that job and grow and thrive in a career. But there are a lot of other factors beyond just academics and knowledge that factor into that, like your peer group, like your network, like the connections and opportunities that you're able to create. But parents place a very high premium on that, as they should. It's very important. But I can't speak for Matt, but I imagine he would agree. But I think a lot of the people that I have had on the show would at least relatively align with the sentiment that if you care about the education of your child and you're worried about the high stakes and you're worried about making a mistake in the education of your child, then that is even more of an indicator that you should not entrust it to the public school system because of all of the shortcomings of the system that Matt and I talked about on today's show. The fact that test scores are going down, but grades are going up. Grades are a meaningless metric. They don't mean anything just because your kid is getting straight A's. Does not mean that they're learning something. There's no accountability and system in place to maintain the standard of a grade. It's a subjective measure and it changes sometimes wildly. The fact that 54% of the American population can't read at a sixth grade level, in spite of the fact that 90% of our children go to public school, and that 90% number is frankly lower than it's ever been. Most of that population went through the public education system at a point in time where that number was higher than 90%. There's been a great exodus over the past few years, especially during and post COVID, of people leaving the system. 10% now doing something other than, whether it's private school, a micro school, homeschooling in a traditional or very untraditional and unschooling sense. There's a great movement away from public education, and yet still the majority of our population is going through the public system, and the academic outcomes on a national level are quite poor. There are many districts where 60 to 80% of the students at any given grade level are not up to grade level in the basic academic subjects of mathematics and reading and writing. There are school districts where there is not a single child in a given grade that is able to do work at grade level. And those are terrible outcomes. And obviously, it varies wildly from state to state and county to county and district to district. Not all districts are created equal. But even in the districts that are good, is that really a level of education that you can trust with something as precious as your child's future? And I think that's a really important question to ask. And that's why so many of the people who have been on the show do the work that they do, is because they've looked at that question head on and they've come to the fundamental conclusion that the answer is no, that children deserve better, that better is possible, and that better is a thing that is worth fighting for and innovating within. Because, building something like Uber, to Matt's point earlier, you can disrupt the entire rideshare industry. You can create the rideshare industry. You can build something that changes the fabric of how a society operates on a day-to-day basis. The necessity for owning a car changes dramatically. It changes the economic and infrastructure levels of a city to have something like Uber in everyone's pocket and immediately accessible. That's a big disruption to, insert into a geographic location, into an economy, into a culture, but it's nothing compared to the level of innovation and disruption that we could see in something as fundamental to the human experience as the education of our children. And I don't even want to put the emphasis on the children because, that's where it starts. And that's the most important thing because the children are, your childhood is your foundation for everything that comes after. But our education in a lifelong sense, because ideally, your education as a child is preparing you for all that comes after, but it's equipping you with the skills to continue learning for the rest of your life, which to be thriving, to be flourishing, to be successful, you need to be iteratively learning. And we need to equip kids with the skills to be able to do that for the rest of their lives. So I think conversations like this are very important because parents have a lot of intuitions about the things that are broken in the system, the things that don't measure up, that don't look right, that don't fit right, that ought to be better. And I think it's very important to name all of those things, especially with someone like Matt, who's been deep in the world of education, both as a practitioner. He went through the education system all the way to the PhD level. He worked inside the university system at a professor in very highly esteemed universities. And he has been working now in the alternative education world in the Montessori movement, building networks of Montessori schools for working in the world for 10 years, building schools for nearly 8, and hearing the perspectives that he has about the education system as we know it is it's important to have that validation as a starting point for figuring out what comes next, what comes after, what comes instead. I've had a lot of amazing people on the show who are building all different sorts of really incredible alternatives to public school. I will have many more on in the coming months and years, but I think it's important to be very clear both about what you're moving away from and what you're running towards. I think when people exit the public school system, they exit for two reasons. They're running away from poor academic outcomes, a culture that they don't agree with or they don't think is healthy for their kids, a set of ideological parameters that they don't agree with, a culture of bullying perhaps that is crushing the soul of their child. They're running away from something that they don't want. But you also can be running towards a vision, a version of your child's education and future that is beautiful and wonderful and virtuous and full of joy and full of meaning, and a thing that you want to go out of your way to deliver to your child. It's not just an alternative to the public system because the public system is no longer acceptable and therefore you must find something else. But it is a thing that you want in its own right because it is better and because it is beautiful and because it is, in your mind, the best thing that you can deliver to your child. And so I think both sides of the conversation are very important. The thing that we're running towards, the thing that we're building, the thing that we're, aspiring for in the future is what a lot of the conversations that I have here are about and what many of the conversations will continue to be. But naming what we're running from is also extremely validating for the parents who are on the journey, who are on the path, who are taking the leap to exit the system and do something other than just adhere to the status quo, which can sometimes be a very lonely road to walk. And sometimes it can feel like you're the only one who sees things as they are. And so I feel like this conversation is very important to have as context, but also, we can have a Grinch episode about all the things that are wrong with the system. But at the end of the day, I think the thing that keeps a lot of us here, at least the thing that keeps me here, I can't speak for anyone else really, but the thing that keeps me invested in this is the fact that I see what's possible, or at least I see a version of it. I see the suggestion of it, and it's very exciting to me, and it's a thing that I want to help steward forth because I want to live in a world where that exists. That's all. You've listened to me ramble long enough. Thank you so much for being here. This is our Christmas episode, and so I just want to take a moment to say thank you, to express my gratitude for all of you for being here. This podcast is not even 6 months old yet, and I have been amazed by the amount of people who are listening, who are leaving me thoughtful comments, who are sending me messages expressing their thoughts on the show, their appreciation for the fact that the show exists. It's incredibly moving to me to sit here recording and think that, my goodness, someone is listening and someone is hopefully being helped by some of this. Hopefully this is helping pave at least a path to finding the infrastructure that is necessary to deliver an amazing education to your children. And I'm feel extremely fortunate to be on this path with you all of self-directed, child-centric, beautiful education. I'm so honored to be a part of this movement of truly incredible people that I've had the chance to meet over the course of building Rebel Educator, spending time on Twitter, building the podcast, meeting all of you. I'm really honored to be a part of this, and I'm really honored that you're taking the time to listen. Thank you so much for supporting all of this. Um, this, you know, maybe would still exist if no one was listening, because I just want to have these conversations, and having a podcast is a great excuse to do so. It's for my own learning as much as anything else. But it certainly would not exist with the level of energy that it does if you weren't all here listening. So thank you so much for being here. Merry Christmas, Happy New Year's, Happy Holidays if you celebrate something other than Christmas. Um, Thank you so much for being a part of this journey this year, and wishing you all the best this holiday season. Hug your loved ones tight. Enjoy whatever traditions you enjoy during the holiday season. And I will see you all next week for the next episode. Thanks, guys. All right, that's a wrap for this week. Thank you so much for being here. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple, please leave a 5-star rating. Ratings are how this show gets discovered by other people, and it helps me bring in better guests. And no matter where you're listening, please like and subscribe to the show to make sure you don't miss a future episode. That's all for this week. Thank you so much for being here. I'll see you next week.